Welcome. Welcome to our visitors as well. Glad you're with us today. This class we have been studying Ezra and Nehemiah, actually Ezra. Next week we'll get into Nehemiah. And so if you'd like to be turning in your Bibles we'll be in Ezra chapter 5 and 6. We'll finish up a little bit chapter 5. We just barely got started last week on Ezra 5, but then we'll finish it up in chapter 6 this morning, and then our curriculum has us going into Nehemiah next week. So glad you're here. Glad you have been very attentive, made good comments. So I really appreciate your addition to the class here. So last week we mentioned that the prophets Haggai and Zechariah came on the scene. They stirred the Jews up so that they began to construct the temple. They kind of encouraged them. The temple resumed construction, and Zerubbabel and Jeshua, who had been the leaders in the construction process, so they kicked it back into gear. They started constructing the temple again, and then we have seen off and on the enemies and those who oppose the construction process try to get it to stop. First of all, we saw the people of the land wrote letters to the kings trying to get them to stop construction. They accused the Jews of saying, if you let them finish this temple project, then they are going to rebel against you. They're going to stop paying tribute. Because in the past, that had happened in the past when Jerusalem rebelled against, at that time, Nebuchadnezzar, would not pay taxes, would not pay tribute. So that's when Nebuchadnezzar came. More importantly, they rebelled against God at that point. But Nebuchadnezzar came, took them away, and but Cyrus, king of Persia, the first king we talked about just about every week, let them return to Jerusalem with the command to rebuild the temple, and gave them everything that they needed to do that. So in chapter 5, we see the enemies of the Jews, in this case Tatnai and Shethar-Boznai, sent a letter to Darius, who's the Persian king at this point, and they were attempting to have the rebuilding of the temple stopped. So that was chapter 5. And so let's start then in chapter 6. So Darius receives this letter that they sent to him requesting construction to stop. Darius, he took the letter seriously, and their accusations that they placed against the Jews, he realized that this was an important letter and it needed to be verified. So 19 years had passed at this point that since Cyrus had reigned, since Cyrus had let the people return. So this is the second year of Darius' own reign as king. He did not remember or could not remember precisely what Cyrus had the charge Cyrus gave to the Jews when they left. So Darius had the archives both in Babylon and Akhmetha and searched. New King James Version calls Akhmetha Ecbatana, and that was the ancient capital city of the Medes that Cyrus had conquered. Apparently that is where a lot of the archives resided. Some of the treasury resided there as well. But the archives of Ecbatana, Darius found a copy of the original letter that Cyrus had sent with the Jews and his command to the Jews as they returned. And that we're going to read in our text today in verses 3 through 5 in Ezra chapter 6, that Cyrus did indeed give the Jews permission to rebuild, to return, to rebuild the temple. He specified that expenses for the timber and the stone, they were to be paid from the national treasury of the Persians. And Cyrus also directed that all the gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar had taken away to be given to the Jews and taken back for the construction of the temple. And we had mentioned that before, I believe. So Haggai and Zechariah now are at hand, and the Jews began to understand God's grace and what he had done for them. They expended all their energy then into rebuilding the temple. But again, because of some of this confusion that what Cyrus's command had been, it was necessary for Darius to search this decree from the former ruler. When he did find that how God's grace and mercy had flowed to the Jews through the generosity of Cyrus and the response of their leaders, Zerubbabel and Jeshua. So they were commissioned to restore the proper worship of God in Jerusalem, and restore it they would. So let's read chapter 6, verses 1 through 12 in this first section. Then King Darius issued a decree, and a search was made in the archives where the treasures were stored in Babylon. And in Achmetha, the palace that is in the province of Media, a scroll was found, and in it a record was written thus. So this is the record that they found having been written. Verse 3. In the first king of King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where they offered sacrifices, and let the foundations of it be firmly laid, its height 60 cubits and its width 60 cubits, with 3 rows of heavy stones and 1 row of new timber. Let the expenses be paid from the king's treasury. I think it's interesting here in these verses, in the commandment that he is giving, he's reiterating those original dimensions of Solomon's temple. And a couple of quarters ago, we talked about the original temple that Solomon had built and all of its dimensions. So I think it's interesting in his writing that he mentioned the dimensions of from how it's to be built. Verse 5, also let the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple, which is in Jerusalem, and brought to Babylon, be restored and taken back to the temple which is in Jerusalem, each to its place, and deposit them in the house of God. So then, since they found that, verse 6 says, Now therefore, Tattenai, governor of the region beyond the river, and Shethar-Boznai, and your companions, the Persians who are beyond the river, keep yourselves far from there. Let the work of this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God on its site. Moreover, I issue a decree as to what you shall do for the elders of these Jews, for the building of this house of God. Let the cost be paid at the king's expense from taxes on the region beyond the river. This is to be given immediately to these men, so that they are not hindered. And whatever they need, young bulls, rams, and lambs for the burnt offerings of the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, and oil, according to the request of the priests here at Jerusalem, let it be given them day by day without fail, that they may offer sacrifices of sweet aroma to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. Also I issue a decree that whoever alters this edict, let a timber be pulled from his house and erected, and let him be hanged on it, and let the house be made a refuse heap because of this. And may the God who causes his name to dwell there destroy any king or people who put their hand to alter it, or to destroy this house of God which is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, issue a decree, let it be done diligently. So the Persians apparently stored these important documents with their treasury. We don't know exactly why that was, why the letter was stored within the treasury, but clearly the treasury would have been guarded closely. So this letter had value. Another option might have been it was just a record of what had been taken out of the treasury, the king's command of what had been in the treasury to provide to the Jews. But certainly Cyrus promised the Jews material support. And this was found in the treasury at Ecbatana in these archives. So Darius found a copy of this, and not only did Cyrus give the Jews permission to leave, he also gave them permission to rebuild the temple, and he specified that the altar be reinstated and built on its old foundation. And we talked about the temple complex and where the altar was in previous lessons. And the cost for the stone and timber for building, it was to be borne by the Persian treasury. So all the Jews in chapter 5 said about Cyrus's letter turned out to be true. So the Jews were trying to rebut some of these arguments that Tatnai was charging against them, but they accurately relayed this information that Cyrus had given them, the command that Cyrus had given them. So if nothing else, or if anything else, the emperor proved to be even more generous than he claimed. So all that silver and gold Nebuchadnezzar had carried into Babylon, that was returned to them, with them to Jerusalem to build and also sacrifice as they wished. But still, Darius found this, but he wasn't finished yet. He told Tatnai and Shethar-Boznai, the governor and his assistant from the province beyond the river, that they were to be at the service of the Jews. The governor of Zerubbabel, he was the governor of the Jews, was to be helped with everything he needed to rebuild the temple. So revenue was to be taken out of those taxes that Darius would have ordinarily collected from the area and directed toward this building project to be able to get the temple completed. So whatever the Jews needed for the sacrifices, the animals and things like that were also to come, the cost of that was to come out of the king's treasury. I think it's interesting, all this was spelled out in Darius' response. I thought it was interesting that to make it abundantly clear what Darius said about what would happen if they didn't agree to cooperate. He said that anyone who altered his command or his words, they were to have a timber taken out of their house, basically impaled on it. So, and his house would become a dunghill. So he was serious about his command about getting that reinstated. So there certainly with threats from reprisal, these people who had complained, got their attention. So they were then seemed to be all of a sudden very cooperative. But everyone then would know, Darius, having read what Cyrus had originally done, he wanted everybody to know that the God who made heaven and earth was to be worshipped at the temple that Zerubbabel and Jeshua were building. Let's read then verses 13 through 18. Then Tatnai, governor of the region beyond the river, Shethar-Boznai and their companions diligently did according to what King Darius had sent. So the elders of the Jews built, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. And they built and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the command of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Now the temple was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, which was in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Then the children of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the descendants of the captivity, celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. And they offered sacrifices at the dedication of this house of God, 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats according to the number of the tribes of Israel. They assigned the priests to their divisions and the Levites to their divisions over the service of God in Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. So no doubt to their chagrin, Tatnai and Shethar Banzai or Boznai, and all their followers. They set out to obey Darius' orders. And the nobles, we see the nobles of Tyre and Sidon. Remember the Phoenicians that had supplied all the timbers and a lot of the supplies for the building of the temple. So they did as Darius also commanded, as the king commanded. So the Samaritans, they gathered and worked together, those people of the area that had been left behind, who had moved in, lived in the area of Samaria. But anyway, those people of that area also chipped in. They worked stone and timber and the supplies the Jews needed. They paid for it out of king's revenue and transported it to Jerusalem. And at this point, Zerubbabel, after this, goes unmentioned later in this book. And Zerubbabel may have died, perhaps while a copy of this letter was going back and forth to Cyrus. And sometime early after Darius ascended to the throne in the emperor's second year, and the completion of the project in Darius' sixth year. So sometime during that period, it's suspected that Zerubbabel passed away, died, because he's not mentioned anywhere else beyond that in this book. So God gave commands to the people of Israel regarding the building of the temple throughout the reigns of Cyrus and Darius, and we're going to see a little later Artaxerxes. The latter ruler may have been included because during his reign, we're going to see him in Nehemiah, and we'll start Nehemiah next week. And Nehemiah came to rebuild the walls of the city. In that line, I believe, if I remember correctly, we talked about the line of Cyrus, Darius. There was Xerxes, which is not mentioned in the Bible, and then Artaxerxes. So within those reigns is the time frame of all this happening when the Persians were in power. And when the work of the building of the temple was complete, it was about 515 BC. So it took approximately 25 years or so, if I read that correctly, from the time that Cyrus let the people return to their homeland of Israel and the time that the temple itself was completed to full completion. And you remember in some of the lessons previously how they had to start and stop, depending on who was opposing them at the time. But in this chapter, finally, the temple is completed, and we talked 2 quarters ago how grand Solomon's temple was. You know, this could not be nearly as grand as that, but is a great thing to celebrate, to have this temple finished, have them a place returned where they could worship God. Remember early on, the altar was one of the first things they completed, so they could start sending sacrifices to God. They started recognizing the feasts that God had commanded them to observe. So when this was completed, the temple was completed, the Jews certainly celebrated. When they completed it, it was on the first month of their year, and it's called the month of Adar, on the 3rd day of the month. And along with their mourning and defeats and lamentations and fasts, the Jews finally had their moment of joy to have this temple completed. So the completion of the temple was recognition that God was with them. You know, it was a celebration of great joy. The priests and the Levites, they put on their finest attire, all the priestly garbs that they were commanded in the law to wear. All those who came back from Babylon gathered together at the appointed time. They had sacrifices and offerings provided in abundance. They had food and drink. It talks about 12 male goats were offered for the sins of the tribes of Israel. And as the law prescribed, the priests and Levites assembled according to their divisions. So the future might bring trying times, but at this point, you know, there's great joy at the completion of the temple, that they finally completed this with all the opposition they had had through the years. The we see let's go on and finish this up in verse 19 through 22. And the descendants of the captivity kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. For the priests and the Levites had purified themselves, all of them were ritually clean. And they slaughtered the Passover lambs for all the descendants of the captivity, for their brethren, the priests, and for themselves. Then the children of Israel who had returned from the captivity ate together with all who had separated themselves from the filth of the nations of the land in order to seek the Lord God of Israel. And they kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with joy, for the Lord made them joyful, and turned the heart of the king of Assyria toward them, to strengthen their hands in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. So at verse 18 is interesting. That is the portion of the text of Ezra that stopped having been written in Aramaic language. After that, in the book, it's written in and preserved in Hebrew language. But the Passover commemorated the time when God came down. He claimed Israel as his people in the first of their months. So Israel was not the most powerful of nations. They were also not the most best religiously or morally. But God made a promise to Abraham, and he repeated this promise to Abraham, to his sons, to his grandson after him. And Passover, we talked about 3 major feasts that they observed. Passover was one of the foremost of those feasts. God said to Israel, you see in Exodus chapter 12, "So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by everlasting ordinance." And then in Deuteronomy chapter 12, God added, "But you shall seek the place where the Lord your God chooses out of all your tribes to put his name for his dwelling place." So the suffering and turmoil had been great for the Jews, but they returned to the place where their fathers and their mothers worshiped, and the temple was rebuilt. The priests and the Levites purified themselves according to the law. They were ceremonially pure, and they presented themselves before God. And they ate together. They separated themselves from the filth of the nations, it says. So they were, again, observing those things in the law, perhaps that they had brought to light and that they had studied while in exile. And we had talked about before, once they came back from exile, they seemed to observe God's law much more diligently because they remembered when they fell away, they were taken into exile, taken away, and God punished them. But now they seem to be very determined to follow God's law, keep his statutes. So attached to that Passover feast was also the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Passover, as you remember, was a reminder that God had passed over the people of Israel while they were in Egypt, and the destroyer that killed the firstborn. And this particular feast remembered God's deliverance from the Egyptians. And it was right after followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that was celebrated for 7 days. And that reminded the people, when they left Egypt, those bitter herbs, the unleavened bread that they were to eat and take with them hastily as they left. They sang and they relived that joy of deliverance, but they could have known no more joy, greater joy than having returned from exile and having this temple rebuilt and to once again be able to worship God according to what his will was. So Israel was never again to be that world power it was when David and Solomon were kings. You remember we talked about what a great power under their rule Israel was and all of their influences, and how David had built up a lot of the wealth, and Solomon through his trade, all the trade routes that Solomon had brought, and through David and Solomon's friendship with Hiram, king of Tyre, all of those supplies that came in for the first temple, Solomon's temple. So it was a great empire at that point. No longer was it just a spot people passed through from Egypt to Mesopotamia during their big points of trade. It became the big controller of trade in the area and became very wealthy. But God worked through Israel. They fell away from God. They were taken into captivity, but now they've come back to Canaan, and they rebuilt the temple, their city, and the priests continue to offer sacrifices. We read in Galatians chapter 4 that in the fullness of time, God sent his only Son to redeem for himself a people. So those who assembled and sang and feasted and rejoiced over the building of this temple, they couldn't hardly imagine what the great things that God had in store for the Savior to come through their lineage and planning to do through them. So anybody past few weeks have anything that strikes them in this story of people coming back out of exile? Any thoughts that might have come up during these stories? I wasn't going anywhere in particular, but just being released from, talk about current day, people being released from Hamas situations where they've been in captivity, and the joy to being released from that aspect, and how the Jews being in captivity, being released, must have had great joy, and especially God working through these Persian kings, giving them the ability to return according to his will, is working through his providence to come back and to restore the line that he had in mind for ultimately being the Savior for all of us. But just that joy in being released from a situation to ultimately work God's plan. Well, next week, this is a little short class period today. But next week we'll start Nehemiah. This is a good breaking point at this point. And if you would next week read the first couple of chapters of Nehemiah, and we'll get into now that the temple is rebuilt, what Nehemiah's efforts were going to be in rebuilding the rest of the city. So if you would read those next couple of chapters and of Nehemiah, we'll start that new book next week. And thank you all again for your attention and your contribution this quarter for comments. So you all have a good day.